Roger Casement was born the son of an Anglo-Irish family. He rose to fame when he spent 20 years living in the Congo. He was a sort of disconnected person, went to the Congo to get away from his upbringing, really. And while in the Congo, he learnt many of the languages. He was an enormously sympathetic man, and he was commissioned by the British government to do an investigation into the horrors of the Belgian rule of the Congo, which exposed things that are unspeakable, really. He estimated 3 million Congolese had died under Belgian rule. It's now thought to be 5 to 8 million. And he brought that to the world's attention, and led to the change in the management of the Congo, the governance of the Congo, with lasting results.
And the pictures in your book of some of the victims who still, and they were given, his mercenaries were given a gun with so many bullets.
Yeah. Yes, so the big industry from the Congo at the time was rubber. And rubber in those days didn't come from trees, it came from vines, which when you tapped them, they died. And so the Congolese were sent deeper and deeper into the jungle to tap these vines. It became harder and harder. And if they weren't getting their quota of rubber, they would be shot. But they were only allowing 1 bullet per person shot. So to prove they'd used their bullet wisely, they would cut the hand off the victim and take it back to be counted. So Casement was interviewing people who had played dead while having their hands cut off.
Yeah. My God.
Wow. So the Congo went to Leopold because he very cleverly played off his cousins, who were the Queen of England and the Kaiser in Germany, and the French. And they thought, well, little Belgium can't do any harm. Leopold said this will be the Congo Free State. It was called the Congo Free State because it'll be a free trading nation, and that will be great for the Congolese. But so nobody had any idea of this secrecy, this secret Holocaust, really.
So we have Roger Casement, and he's grown up in a Protestant family, and he's joined the British establishment. He goes out to the Congo where he sees horrors beyond all belief. That shocks him to his core, doesn't it?
Yes, and he's immensely courageous. In fact, his first years in the Congo, he's doing a bit of trading, doing a bit of exploring. He really joins the British Foreign Office in order to write his report. But because he spent so long there, he really understands the Congolese. He speaks some of the many, many languages, and he charters a boat that takes him further up the Congo River than any other non-Belgian European had been. And it is that gives him the insight. Plus, he was a man of vast sympathies, and people poured out their stories to him. And his report, which is available online, is a really shocking document. But you can hear between every line of it how people were longing to tell him their stories because they had decades of this treatment.
And other people that if you were having any problems with your neighbours, just kill them. He was able to talk to them and broker, but by his persuasion.
Yes, he was the only non-missionary white man that any of them had talked to, but because of his character, they told him everything. Their reports of him as he steamed up the river to more and more of these places, of them paddling after him in their canoes, shouting out their stories to him.
Oh
and the great film Apocalypse Now, which is based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and he met Joseph Conrad.
He's a good friend.
Before Conrad had published a word, Conrad went to the Congo as a steamboat captain, still with his Polish name, and he spent 3 weeks basically living with Casement, and they would talk late into the night, and Conrad recorded in his diary Casement going off alone just with his dog and having what palavers is the local word with the chiefs, and getting his way. But at that point, he was a trader by speaking rather than by force. And Conrad said in his diary, the things he has told me, the horrors he has seen. I believe Casement was a real influence on Heart of Darkness, which came out 10 years later.
Amazing.
When he went to the Congo, working for the British government, was he conflicted at all about imperialism at that point, or was he went off to do a job in a system that he thought was entirely acceptable?
I think he probably did. His childhood, he was orphaned very young. He had a strange childhood. I suspect his mother was an alcoholic, possibly his father as well. They lived a sort of itinerant life. He was very much the youngest of 4 children. They lived sort of itinerant life around suburbs of London in boarding houses in Dorking. They never had any money. His mother died when he was 6 or 7, and his father died shortly afterwards. And the only settled period of his childhood was when his father was first of all ill and then died, and he went to live with his uncle in Antrim. And there he became fascinated by Irish history, reading in his uncle's library. And then when he left school at 15 and went to work, he never settled anywhere. He was homosexual. I don't know if he knew it at that point, but that might have made him feel disconnected. And at the first opportunity, he went to work for a shipping company in Liverpool that serviced the Congo. And at the first opportunity, he went to the Congo on a ship and started working there. So he's a strangely unsettled figure. Unsettled upbringing. He was baptized both Protestant and Catholic. As I say, orphaned young. And I think he just wanted to get away. I doubt he had any particular anti-colonial opinions.
But but his years in the Congo turned him.
Yes,
on that
his
particular
years in
score.
the Congo turned him, and then his next role after the Congo was he was appointed by the British government again to go and investigate the Amazon rubber industry, which was a very, very sensitive business because what he was investigating was the largest company on the London Stock Exchange and also the company that supplied about 90% of Britain's rubber, which was essential for cabling and car tyres at that time. We're now in about 1910. And
who was that company?
It was called the Anglo-Peruvian Rubber Company.
Oh.
It was run by a pair of Peruvian, well, they were crooks really, but there was a real danger they'd declare the company bankrupt, at which point it would be a disaster, financial disaster and a rubber disaster. What he saw there, in the way of horrors, eclipsed what had gone on in the Congo, and that was really terrible things. And he wrote his second great report, for which he was knighted. He became famous throughout the world. He spent a lot of time in Washington because of their interests in Latin America. And that cemented his feeling that exploitation of any form of indigenous peoples was absolutely abhorrent. And it was after that he started his work on Irish nationalism, fired up by his experiences.
And at this point, we're in the first decade of the 20th century.
That's right.
And
yes.
the First World War is on the horizon.
Yes.
So what happens when he takes up the Irish causes?
Well, he writes the manifesto for the Irish Volunteers, and he preaches the volunteers' cause right around Ireland, recruiting huge numbers of volunteers. He, in response to the Ulster Volunteers gun running, Carson's gun running, he sets up the gun running expedition that Erskine Childers, then carries out for him. And he's a very big name in the world, and it's then thought to be a good idea for him to go to the United States in the summer of 1914, just after he'd set up the gun running, to raise funds, which he does very successfully for a short period of time. But then the First World War looms, and and funds start to dry up, and he then has this scheme to go to Germany to raise an Irish brigade, which is the beginning of his next great chapter. Before he leaves New York, he embarks on the only romantic relationship of his life, which is with a Norwegian sailor called Adela Christensen, who Casement does not know is actually married and has a child in the United States. But Casement really loves this man, who is to betray him from the moment they arrive in Oslo, Christiania, as it was called in those days, where Casement sends, we know from Casement begins a diary when he gets to Germany, and he says he sends Adler off to send a telegram to New York saying they've arrived and to do a bit of shopping, and yet from the files in the National Archives in Kew, outside London, we can see that. So in Casement's diary, he says Christensen comes back very perturbed, saying he'd been approached in the hotel lobby and taken off in a big car to this address that they look up, and it turns out to be the British legation. But we know from the National Archives that far from that, Christensen makes straight for the British legation and says, I can tell you everything about the man I'm travelling with. And the diplomat has written, and you can see in the file, I suspect them of having unnatural relations, which is then crossed out so it doesn't go back in his telegram to London. So where Casement thought the British, his employers, the people who'd knighted him and so on, were betraying him or spying on him, in fact, it was his lover who was betraying him to the British.
Wow.
And we're almost at the end of the story now, aren't we? Because, your book is called Broken Angel.
I call it that. It's something T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, another great anti-colonialist, anti-British colonialist, said of him about 2 weeks before Lawrence was killed on his motorbike. He said, he wrote to a friend saying, I plan to write a biography of Casement. I think of him as a broken archangel, and that's where I got the title. Yeah.
So he returns from Germany. What did anyone think about this plan to rustle up a brigade in Germany to? He's
in Germany quite a long time. He's in Germany from October 1914, 110 years ago today, in fact, to Good Friday 1916. So he's there 18 months. And his plan is to raise a brigade of soldiers from the Irish prisoners of war in Germany and use them. And the Germans are up for this. They gather all the prisoners of war into one camp, and Casement goes and talks to them, which we'll come on to. And to use that brigade to invade Ireland. So just because Casement believed Germany would win the war, but he had to separate out Ireland in the German mind so that after the war it didn't continue to be a colony of, it would then be a colony of Germany, because Home Rule, of course, had been suspended for the duration of the war. So he goes off to Frankfurt. The Germans gather together pretty quickly, 2,500 Irish prisoners of war, put them all into one camp. And Casement goes and talks to them. And we know from the testimony of some of these soldiers that it's a pretty good disaster. Mm-hmm. So one of them says this very tall man, he spoke with an English accent, Casement. This very tall man arrived in a German staff car surrounded by German officers and lectured to us about the ancient kings of Ulster and how he had to emulate them. And these men were really puzzled because they joined up. They hadn't been conscripted. They joined up as often as not to get their families' money, and their pay was still going to their families while they're prisoners of war. Their best friends in many cases had been killed fighting beside them. And there was this man telling them to go and invade their own country. It was a pretty good disaster. Only about 20 to 30 showed any inclination to join up, and I think a lot of them were simply looking for a ticket home. And he went 4 or 5 times between the end of 1914 and the end of 1915, effectively. And it was an ill-conceived idea that went nowhere. And quite soon his German hosts lost interest in him, having been offering, I mean, they still offered uniforms and guns and things. But also at the same time, he was right in with the Germans and met the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister and everything. And people began to say to him, you've got to get rid of that man, Adler Christensen, his lover, because he's not doing you any good. Nobody likes him, nobody trusts him. And Casement couldn't bear that. He loved this man. And effectively he had a nervous breakdown. He spent Christmas 1915 in a sanatorium in Germany.
God.
He spent so much time in Germany. Was the British establishment not onto him?
The British establishment did get onto him because of Christensen's betrayal. As soon as they began opening letters going to his associates, and they were onto him, and they took away his pension. There was a number of questions in Parliament. They took away his pension, but at the same time, he kept sending Christensen to Norway to talk with made-up things about minefields around Ireland and things, and believing that this would divert at least a lot of naval ships to protect these German minefields, fight against these German minefields. But in fact, the British weren't taking him seriously at all, but Christensen would come back and say they swallowed that, and they want me to lure you out into the North Sea and knock you over the head. So the fact that he felt he was being betrayed by his former employees, the people who'd knighted him, the people he'd done extraordinary work for in the Congo and the Amazon. It ended with he wrote a long letter to the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who'd been his great supporter, and indeed was still in cabinet, saying you've got to give this man some leeway. And he wrote this long letter and sent it to all the newspapers as well as Grey, and only 2 newspapers in Britain picked up on it, and they both said Casement alleges absurd plot, and that he felt he was friendless. Yeah.
It's all over. Yeah.
He returns to Ireland Easter 1916.
So in the end, the German government give up on him, and they say you've got to go back with whatever soldiers you can. And he says, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go back alone. In fact, he goes back with 2 other people on a U-boat, and he is determined to stop the rising at that point. That's what he goes back to do. The Germans also are sending a boat with 20,000 rather rusty iron rifles for use by the Irish. But through a chapter of miscommunications, the ship with the rifles is apprehended and is scuttled, but the crew are imprisoned. And so Casement arrives on Bannerstrand with these other 2 people. He's really ill. He's always suffered from sort of tropical malaria and other diseases he's picked up in the Congo, but he's been incredibly seasick on this voyage on the U-boat. And the other 2 men he's with go off and try to find him help, to try and find the volunteers in Tralee, the local town. And he stays behind. He hides in a ring fort near the beach, waiting for help to come and get him, where he's Meantime, they found detritus on the beach from their landing, including a couple of pistols. So the police are searching the area, and they take him in about 5 hours after he's landed in his beloved country. He's arrested.
Yeah.
What an end.
And then tried and
And he's
executed.
brought to London for trial, and there's a lot of debate. The government know exactly how diplomatically difficult this is, and they decide not to give him a military trial, such as the people executed for the rising had in Dublin. But they give him a civil trial so it can be reported on, and he is tried for treason. He doesn't really have a defence, and in the court he gives the speech of his lifetime about colonialism and its evils, which is a wonderful piece of rhetoric, but it's inevitable that he will be condemned to death. What happens after that is there's a huge international outcry to get him reprieved from the gallows, and H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw writes a speech for him in court, and so on, and all the great writers, John Galsworthy, sign a petition. The Archbishop of Canterbury goes to see Asquith, and we can see from the cabinet papers that Asquith is saying to the Home Office, is there any way we can get him a plea of insanity, because that is the only thing that will spare him execution. And they can't find anything for that. Meantime, there's this, and the ambassador in Washington is saying you can't execute him or the Americans might not join the war because the Irish-American lobby is so strong. Meantime, there's this wicked policeman who's interrogated him, who has his diaries from 1903, in which there are a number of references to rent boys in London during his time in London 13 years earlier. And they photograph these pages, and you can still see in the National Archives the first 8 pages of this diary have been torn out. And they photograph these pages and send it round to, they certainly send it to the ambassador in Washington because he's asked for it. They get word to the Archbishop of Canterbury that these pages exist, and all the support falls away. And the Archbishop of Canterbury recants. He's earlier said, this man's done more good than any of us will ever do in his life. He now won't say a word. And that is it. Casement would have been executed anyway because there was no plea of insanity, but it damages his reputation both amongst his supporters and amongst the Irish for a very long time to come. I think he knew he'd reached the end of the road, and I think he thought the martyr's death was the only future for him. He, as I said, he was a very passionate man, and all his passion had been spent.
Yeah,
Amazing.
well, his name lives on.
And the book is extraordinary. The reviews you've had are extraordinary. Congratulations, honestly, Roland.
And you're coming here to talk
On the
About the book.
27th, yes.
of November.
Yeah, of November, yes.
What day of the week is that?
It's a Wednesday.
It's a
You
Wednesday.
can ask questions after
Yeah.
the lecture.
It's
so
gonna
it'll
be great,
brilliant.
yes.
And there'll be books on sale as well, so
Yeah.
you'll get a signed copy because Roland will do a signing.
I certainly will.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. That is a fantastic story. So if you want to know more or ask questions about Roger Casement, get a ticket for the 27th right here at the Irish Cultural Centre.